Restart the thing. So again, the kind of general Kleinian method for figuring out ontological commitment, broadly 3 steps. Right? We take our theory, we decide which sentences our theory is true. This is basically just construct a theory. Regiment the sentences of that theory into our canonical notation. That is first order logic. And then the commitments are going to be the things we quantify over, or the things that must be quantified over in order for the sentences to be true. So that's the kind of process. This is the Kleinian method for determining ontological commitment, the Kleinian project of ontology. So obviously, well, probably the biggest step in this is the regimentation, that second step. And this is essential both in terms of kind of laying bare the explicit structure, and also it is where we're actually going to get out the commitments. Because the implications and entailments of our theory, of our claims, aren't always going to be explicit in natural language, but once we make that move into FOL, once we make it into our canonical notation, as Klein puts it, right, those should be laid bare. So just as a very simple test case, again going back to one of the ones we talked about, Verrier's Vulcan case, one of the sentences in the theory that's supposed to be true is something like, Vulcan causes Mercury's retrograde motion, which we can formalize as something like this, right? So we'll have V as the predicate vulcanizes, M is the predicate mercurizes, and C is causes to go into retrograde motion. So there's an X, there's a Y, X is the vulcanizer, Y is the mercurizer, and X causes Y to go into retrograde. Again, this is a very silly kind of symbolization. It would probably be better to work it out in much more detail, but it gets you the basic idea. By having these two quantifiers, we're committed then to there being some things. A mercurizer and a vulcanizer. This is why we can see that things like Vulcan are going to be committed to this theory. Again, it's just a silly example, but hopefully it brings out the thought. Because regimentation is so easy, the big issue here is how we regiment. The surface level grammar of our initial theoretic expression, right, the natural language, isn't going to really tell us the commitments. In fact, it will often mislead us. This can be really simple, or this can be very complex. But one of the things that we have in our toolkit, and this was the other really neat thing that Klein gave us to do ontology, is a paraphrase strategy. So the paraphrase strategy is a tool we have if we, on the face of it, are committed to stuff we don't want to be. So the idea with the paraphrase is that if your claim prima facie commits you to something you don't want in your ontology, what you should do is paraphrase that thing away. And by paraphrasing it away, what I mean is find a way to keep your sentence meaning the same, but structure it so that you no longer quantify over the problematic entity. Here's a cheap example. It's a very funny one, right? You might say something like, for heaven's sake, don't do that. Or another one, this is my father's favorite example, for fuck's sake, you fucking moron, right? Insight into my childhood there. It's a joke. But no, what do these kind of sentences suggest? Right? Setting aside that this is a command, if we take it as some kind of assertion, it looks like it requires you being committed to something like sakes. And what the hell is a sake? Exactly. So on the face of it, that's a problem. But of course, what you really want to do is you just read for heaven's sake, not as actually expressing some entity, you're not doing it for this thing, right? Or for the benefit of this thing. It's just a way to suggest extra emphasis, right? So really, we could paraphrase this as something like, I strongly suggest not doing that. Where there's no quantification of anything like six. Another really silly one is, right, how will we get to the Dante building? Well, you can go this way, you can go that way. So there are two ways. Are ways over and above just paths? Or, I don't know, spatial temporal pathways? Ways seem like the sort of thing we don't necessarily want to have in our ontology. But I just told you there are two ways. So what would I really say is, you can go this way, or you can go that way. There aren't going to be two things that are ways. There's two routes to take. So what's, again, the lurking thought with the paraphrase strategy is if on the face of it your grammar apparently commits you to something you don't want, you find a way to massage the language so that you don't have the commitment you didn't want in your ontology. This will be a little bit easier to come to terms with when we think about some examples. So I'm going to give you 3 examples from the last 60 years or so, some of which are kind of silly, some of which are slightly more interesting, but they'll kind of give you an idea of how this Quinian stuff works out and how the paraphrase strategy applies. Note 2 things about the paraphrase move. First is, it's got to be a paraphrase. Again, if you remember, we talked about this way back when we were doing our symbolization. Whatever you do, you can't lose the meaning. Or perhaps more clearly, what you better not do is change the truth conditions. That is, if you give a new sentence that is true in certain circumstances when the other one isn't, you fucked up. You haven't kept the whole sentence. You've changed the topic. The paraphrase must be true if and only if your original is true. If you can get a change between those, you do not have a proper paraphrase. You're just saying something new. Similarly, it only goes so far. While it might allow you to get around certain commitments, it's not going to let you get out of every commitment. Eventually, you're going to have to pay the price. That is, commit yourself to something. But it does importantly offer you away some weird oddities. For example, if you talk about sakes, if you talk about ways, etc., etc. So let's talk about some examples, and hopefully this will kind of highlight how these things work. Again, stop me if things don't make sense. So here's our first one from one of my absolute favorite papers ever, Holes by Steffi and David Lewis. So Holes is a dialogue between a materialist and a non-materialist. But we'll set the dialogue aside, we can just talk about it from Argall's perspective, the materialist. So suppose that one is a thoroughgoing materialist. That is, the things that you want in your ontology are all and only material objects. Stuff that has mass and takes up space-time. You importantly don't believe in intellecties or spirits or auras or deities or other things unknown to physics. So again, on this strict materialist view, you only want material objects, that is, things that have mass, things that take up space-time. So you want to say things like, there are no holes. Holes don't exist. Because holes are entities that, by their definition, wouldn't have mass and wouldn't occupy space-time. Exactly. Notably, this isn't a hole. This is an invention. Yes, but the molecules are having the mass. That's the thing. So we can commit to the molecules. But what we want to say is there such a thing as a whole? Yes. That's exactly the kind of thing we're worrying about, right? Yes. But the thing is, right, what we would have is effectively something like there's some cheese, some cheese, some cheese, and then there's this thing. And it's one thing if we say all there is just there's air occupying that region. That's fine. But this is to say there's no whole. Instead, it's just kind of cheese, 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 air, cheese, 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 cheese. So what we're really worried about is there this thing that is a whole? The kind of distinct entity that isn't just the cheese, 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 air, cheese, cheese, cheese. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but then you come back to the paraphrase, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're going with.
Because it's the whole air to paraphrase for air.
Something like that. That's going to be good. Yeah.
Well, talking about whole, maybe
Yes. So importantly, what we are going to have to do, right? This materialist view is going to be committed to certain things. It's going to want to say stuff like there are molecules, there are electrons, quarks, leptons, all that kind of thing. What it doesn't want to do is postulate anything that isn't just going to be a material object. All of these things are material. What we can't have are immaterial things. Shadows are going to be weird. Holes are going to be weird, because holes, prima facie, aren't material objects. They're gaps in material objects. So they want to say there are no such things as holes. Here's the other trick, though. Our materialists will often say things that on their surface will commit themselves to holes. They'll say things like, there are holes in this piece of cheese. There are 3 holes, 8 holes, however many. And obviously this is a problem. If this is part of their overall theory, and this is part of their overall theory, we have a contradiction. There are no of these, and there's at least some of these problems. So how do we resolve it? Something I suggested. We've got pickle, which is something that the materialists believe. So to get around it, what we're going to have to do is paraphrase whole talk. Exactly how we want to do that, that's sort of up for grabs. Here's a suggestion. Because remember, all we have to do is avoid quantification over the holes. So whenever we have things like there are holes in this piece of cheese, let's read it this way. This piece of cheese is perforated. So what does this sentence quantify over? Just cheese. Right? It says there's a piece of cheese, and it has the predicate perforated. So its commitment to only cheese, which is the sort of thing that our materialist is very happy with. So far, so good. And by paraphrasing this way, the materialist avoids commitment to holes. They basically package whole talk into predicates, which aren't the sort of things that ever be quantified over. Okay. This looks like we've got a resolution to our problem. But we can push the problem a little further. And the problem is that we have to give what we think of as a systematic paraphrase. What I mean by that is, it's fine to just ad hoc treat single sentences. But what we need is a story about how to treat all whole talk. And this is important because remember, if there's even a single sentence that quantifies over wholes that our materialist cannot paraphrase away, that is, understand so as to not quantify over wholes, then they do not dodge the commitment. Because to be, and to be committed to, is just to quantify over. There's even one sentence that our would-be materialist has and accepts as true, that they cannot tell a story that doesn't involve quantifying over these weird entities they must be new. So this is why we need a systematic paraphrase to say, this is how we deal with all of these kinds of sentences. So we might have something like, there's a hexagonal hole in this piece of cheese, and we see the move. The move is going to be to allow for the perforation to take a modification, which is a lovely term phrase. So we'll say something like, this sentence can be paraphrased as, this piece of cheese is hexagonally perforated. Again, you see the move? So what we're doing is a materialist is trying desperately to avoid the commitment to the hole. Here's a potential problem. Take this. There are as many holes in my cheese as in your cracker. Now, how might we paraphrase things so that this is going to come out true? Supposing it is, right? We look at our cheese, there's 4 holes. We look at our cracker, there's 4 holes. So we want this sentence to come out true. How would we make that true? Yeah, good, right? So we keep playing on this notion of perforation. But of course, we might not want to just do it in terms of many times as, because that looks like it's going to quantify over times. Which is maybe something we're okay with, but that's certainly not times as in seconds, that's times as in like counting kind of times. So we might do something like this. Either my cheese is singly perforated and the cracker is 2, or my cheese is doubly perforated and my cracker is 2, or and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. And note that this is going to be perfectly fine too if we talk about shape instead of number. My cheese is hexagonally perforated just like your cracker. Cool. Again, it's not the most beautiful formulation in the world. This is not going to trip off the tongue, but it's systematic. Yeah.
And also paraphrase it as my cheese is perforated as my cracker.
Yeah, so I think this might be something, but again, we might wonder how we can understand that sentence, right? What's going to ground that out? If it's going to be something like a kind of equinumerous relation, or these kinds of lovely moves. Because what do we want to do if it's got the same shape as holes ass? That's why this is a lovely little paraphrase, because it lets you just slide in whatever modifiers you want. But yeah, nice. Right? So this paraphrase is ontologically neat and parsimonious. What do I mean by this? It's neat in that it gives us a story to tell with every kind of claim that we're going to run across. We know how to map whole talk, at least with regards to cheese, into this kind of sentence. And it's parsimonious. Does everyone know what I mean by that word? Have you come across that word before? So it means minimal number. So it's parsimonious in the sense that it has minimal commitments. I'm not going to have to postulate more stuff than I want to. I only need to postulate material objects. And I have a very simple, direct story to tell that will help me take care of all the whole talk. But no, while it's ontologically parsimonious, it's complex in another way. We pay the price for our ontological simplicity by increasing the complexity of our paraphrase. I went from my cheese and this cracker have the same number of holes to this fucking beast. And note that this is going to be infinitely wrong. Yeah, good. So the reason why we couldn't just go straight forward into perforation is we want to be able to handle all of the kind of hole talk that we want. So you might want to talk about the shape of the holes in the cheese, or the number of holes in the cheese. So in effect, all we're doing is just by moving to something like perforation talk, but slightly complex perforation talk. That's really the move. So it's not too far away from that, but it's just making sure that we have the space to allow for the adjectives to describe the perforation. Okay. So cool. Do we see the first sort of story? This is the first kind of slightly silly example, but it's a lovely case, right? Where we have this one particular ontology we want to make work. There's these one really silly kind of objects that are in the way, and then we talk, how can we make it make sense? Okay, so that's wholes. Let's talk about another example with tables. So this is going to sound really weird, but there's been a very long debate in contemporary ontology about whether tables exist. I refute it does. But genuinely, a heavy debate about whether tables exist. So here's how it goes. Suppose you're a reductionist. So this is something like a physicalist, something like a materialist. But a reductionist wants to go even further. They don't want to just postulate physical objects. They only want to postulate the little teeny tiniest ones. They think all that's really out there are the leptons, the quarks, stuff like that. And it's all of those in very complex arrangements that give us these things. And in fact, this is kind of the way that lots of people think about microphysics, right? The big things are just all of these little super teeny tiny particles arranged in very careful, complex patterns to give us this. So, suppose you're one of these reductionists. You only want to postulate the existence of these kind of basic entities, fundamental objects, leptons, quarks. We'll just call them particles. Now, in everyday speech, you're going to say things like, this table's brown, or my coffee cup is on the table. No, these sentences are going to be a big problem for you, because you don't believe in tables. There is no such thing as a table. It's way too fucking big. In fact, you couldn't even say I, because well, I'm much bigger than a lepton or a quark or anything like this. There's an issue here. So how can you maintain your reductionism, if you want to, and still make sense of these kinds of claims? Now note, you could always just say, okay, cool, I don't believe that this table's brown. That's just a false sentence. That is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's going way too far, way too quickly. So how can we make sense of table talk? Well, unsurprisingly, we're going to use the paraphrase. Right? We're going to be very careful. Whenever we have seemingly complex objects, says the reductionist, that's just fast and loose talk. What we really have are very complex collections and arrangements of these simple particles. So when I say the table is brown, what I'm really saying is there's a collection of particles, and this collection is arranged table-wise, and it is brown. Note, what we have to have is a predicate like this. Table-wise, but that's fine. Predicates are cheap. They're very easy to generate. Remember the point I said earlier about pegasizing, things like this. So the strategy for the reductionist is when confronted with apparent commitment to everyday objects, medium-sized dry goods, as they're sometimes jokingly called, we paraphrase this talk into stuff that only quantifies over the simple particles. Now note, in order to make this work, we're going to have to postulate lots of weird something-wise predicates. Person-wise, building-wise, chair and table-wise, etc., etc., etc. Finger-wise.
In that sense, that's it. So this collection is brown. Sometimes then, it is brown, because of the itself. So I don't really cases all the way down.
Well, note that the is brown isn't going to be anything quantifiable, right? That's a predicate. So this is like is human, or is tall, or whatever you want. So it isn't saying that there is this thing brownness that I'm getting into. Instead, the only thing that this is going to be committed to is collections of particles. And then we're going to say, and those collections of particles have the following two predicates to satisfy. They're either stabilized and they're brown. Now, of course, and maybe this is where you're worried about, how in the hell can a collection of particles be brown? They look like the kinds of things that don't really satisfy us. And we'll have to tell a complex story about how to do it.
Yeah. So I am feeling, this sounds really weird, but that you should say in this collection is a range of cloud marks.
Actually, probably what you really want to say is something like, and this collection reflects light in such and such a manner in such and such a way.
Yeah.
Right? And then you're totally just avoiding any kind of talk of color. You're just doing it in terms of spectrums of light.
Yeah.
That would be a way to go. Again, these are kind of toy cases to get us going. So note, what this really highlights is, again, how complex these paraphrases actually will have to be. So, again, we see the kind of move. This is a slightly silly example, but there's an underlying theory here, which is about what we call mereology. Mereology is the study of parts and wholes. Wholes with a W there. And for the mereological nihilist, all we have are the parts. Wholes are just arrangements of little tiny parts. For everyone else who isn't a nihilist, we have these things. The nihilist uses this kind of move to help explain away our talk of these apparently large-scale objects. Here's the big threat, though, with this project. If there's even one sentence that our reductionists cannot adequately paraphrase, the whole process has failed. They're going to be committed to things like tables. They have to give us a systematic story. The systematic story has to account for every sentence they want to be true. Yes? Good. So this is one of the big objections to this kind of move. In order to understand what this predicate is, we have to already know what tables are. This is a potential objection to this kind of reduction. Note that what this is doing is effectively drawing out apparent commitments, even underneath this paraphrase. Again, we're already kind of rolling into what this story is telling us. Nice. Okay. One last example. This is one of my favorites. Fictional characters. So fictional characters are paradigmatic things that don't exist. Holmes is an amazing detective. It's a shame he doesn't exist. Poirot is an amazing detective. Also a shame he doesn't exist. Okay. So, that's fair. But consider much of our ordinary talk about these kinds of things. Holmes is a detective. Seems true, in some sense of true. Holmes is a milkman. Seems false, in some sense of false. Hamlet is Dutch. No, he's Danish. But of course, is Hamlet? Well, no, strictly not. Right? Maybe he's based on, this character is based on some real person, but Hamlet the character is not. Now, but think about these sentences again. This one, prima facie, then seems true. This one, prima facie, seems false. Something like this. Of course, in order for these to be true or false, it looks like we have to have Holmes. We read them as being committed to Holmes. This says there is such a thing as Holmes, and it's a detective. This says there is such a thing as Holmes, and it's a milkman. Even to be false, Looks like we at least need to be able to talk about Holmes. For it to be true, we need to talk about Holmes. Well, what we can do with these is paraphrase them as something like, in the Holmes stories, Holmes is said to be a detective. So in these cases, we're not committing to Holmes, not quantifying over it. We're saying, according to some story. And this is fine. This just commits us to stories. We're happy with stories. They're the kinds of things we tell each other all the time. You might even understand them just as theories. So far, so good. So on this initial move, we can have our character talk without committing to the existence of characters. Okay? Now, Peter Van Inwagen, in a very famous paper from the late 70s, suggests actually there isn't a way to paraphrase away all fictional character talk. We might try and do it always in terms of the story move, but it doesn't always work. In particular, it doesn't work when we think about what are often called metafictional or parafictional claims. So metafictional claims are things like, Holmes is more famous than any detective today. It's very hard to figure out how to read this where it doesn't quantify over Holmes. We can't say it's true according to the Holmes stories. That's just false. The Holmes stories don't say anything about the detectives today. But this certainly seems true. A similar one, this is an example from Van Inwagen. There are characters in some 19th century novels who are presented with greater wealth of physical detail than any character in any 18th century novel. Again, don't stress too much about the particular example, but note the quantificational structure. It's saying there are characters in these kinds of stories that are more detailed than any characters in these kinds of stories. To make this sentence make sense, we have to quantify over characters. And it's really hard to think of a suitable paraphrase that doesn't involve quantifying over those things. A last really similar and a jokey one is Arnold Schwarzenegger is stronger than Frodo, where we take real world and fictional entities and compare them. Again, it's very hard to think about how to understand this that doesn't involve quantifying over the fictional entity and comparing them to something we have in real life. Again, we can quibble about the particular examples, but all that matters is that we even have one. If we have one sentence that we take to be true, that apparently quantifies over characters that we cannot paraphrase away, we have to believe in them. We're committed to it. Now, of course, it doesn't say anything about what the hell they are. They could be abstract objects. They could be anything. That's another story to tell. But from the perspective of commitment, if we can't get rid of these sentences, if we can't paraphrase them, we're committed. As Van Inwagen puts it, it looks like our everyday fictional character talk commits us to the theoretical entities of literary criticism. Whatever the hell those are, we don't really care. We know they have to be in our ontology. Okay. So that's the general kind of Quinean methodology. We're going to take our theories, rigidify them, regiment them into our formal language, and then see what we have to quantify over. And we have the paraphrase strategy to help us if the kind of regimentation takes us to commitments we don't want. Figure out ways to change it so we don't quantify over the things we didn't want. So in the last 10 minutes, I want to talk about some potential issues. The first thing to notice is Quine methods is extremely powerful and extremely useful and extremely simple. But of course, like all things, it has issues. To get a feeling for issues, let's think about a very silly example. So let's think about how we would regiment the following two sentences into first-order logic, and then what Quine would say we're ontologically committed to. So here's two. Some donuts have pink sprinkles, and all donuts have pink sprinkles. how might we regiment these two sentences into first-order logic? So obviously, right, we're going to figure out the domain, but what sort of predicates would we use? That'd be one, right? So we could have something like dx and then hx, right? That's one way we could go. We have just the two predicates. But that's not the only way we have to go, right? We could do more. How else could we read it? We could have pink as a predicate, but if we have pink as a predicate, are we going to be able to get by with just donuts? And what else are we going to have in our ontology? Because what does pink modify? Sprinkles, right? So we're going to have, there are things that are donuts, there are things that are sprinkles, the sprinkly things are pink, and we're going to need to say at least one more thing. What's the other thing we need to say? Yeah, right? We have to have a have relation, right? So note now, in this new formulation that we just did, our ontological commitments have grown. Because we're committing ourselves to donuts and we're committing ourselves to sprinkles. But in the initial formulation, where we just had dx and hx, I only had donuts. My ontology was only donuts.
Concepts are made of simple concepts, and you can go on and on and on and on until the very end.
Nice.
And you can't stop that.
This is the worry, right? So how we're going to unpack these, how we're going to do the notation, is going to then commit us to different things.
You can go sprinkles with water sprinkles, yeah. Things that are made of sugar, water sugar, energy substance provides unique benefits to the organisms. Certain organisms, and you go on and on, and that's just stuff.
Yes, exactly. In this one sentence, we might be committing ourselves to digestive systems. And so do we see now, this is one of the tricks. This is one of the tricks. This method is extremely useful, powerful, simple. But the big trick is, how the hell do you do your regimentation? The same thing with our second one. Something really funny. Our second one, how would we express our second one? Which quantifier would we use? Is it, yeah? It's a universal, right? It says everything that's a donut is going to be a pink sprinkle haver, right? Something like this. So if we do it that way, are we committed to anything? If I say everything that's a donut has pink sprinkles, am I ontologically committed to anything? Think about the structure of the sentence. It's going to be something like, do I need to be ontologically committed to anything for this to be true? What's an easy way for this kind of, it's going to say more. What's an easy way for this to be true? Yeah, right? So here's a really cool thing. 2 doesn't commit me to donuts. Do we see why? Because the only thing, remember, what's for quality? The only thing that does ontological commitment is that one. And all donuts have pink sprinkles. Doesn't commit me to donuts. Yeah.
When you talk about when you find
Okay, flying, not speaking. So what we might think is that to fully flesh out the theory, what we would have to have is all donuts have pink sprinkles and there are donuts. Then we're going to be committed to donuts. But no, it's not this one that's doing it. It's the second sentence that's doing it. When I say, and there are donuts, that's closer to this one. Because remember, the big trick, only whenever we have that.
So, that's correct. Yeah. Let's say, want to say that I'm so committed to donut.
But note again, what's doing the lifting here, what's doing the commitment, isn't that all donuts, it's that, and there are some. There are some. Again, this is one of the weird issues with this Quinean program. Quantification's very cool, but it's always and only just that existential that does the that does the committing. So to kind of draw this out, what we really have, and this kind of comes back to the thing we were talking about a second ago, is there's two major notions in the background. We have the ontology of a theory, that is, what a given theory says there is. And then we have what we'll call the ideology of a theory. And what we really mean by this is what predicates the theory employs. What predicates we're going to use when we regiment the expression of the theory. So again, to go back a slide, if we use donuts and have pink sprinkles as our ideology, as the two predicates we buy into, this is a very simple sentence. It only commits us to donuts. If we go with donuts, a have relation, a pink predicate, and sprinkles as a predicate, then we're committed to donuts, we're committed to sprinkles. If we count up these predicates further, we might be committed to yet more things. The level of complexity we have with our ideology is tied up with the level of complexity we have for our ontology. Oftentimes, what we'll do is we will pay for one in terms of the other. This is what we were doing with our paraphrasing. Right? My reductionist about tables, the one who says that there are no such things as tables, it's just collections of symbols arranged table-wise. They have to buy into a hell of a lot of ideology. They have to have these predicates that are table-wise. They have a very simple ontology, very complex ideology in this sense. Flip that around, the person who you might think of as a kind of naive ontologist, who just, this table's brown, cool, there are tables, right? For heaven's sake, don't do that, cool, there are sakes. They have a very simple ideology. Just read the predicate straight off. You just read the complexity from the surface grammar. They have a very complex ontology. Lots and lots and lots of things. In fact, one of the most fun kind of extremes of this is if you call objectivism. There's only one object. It is all of space-time. It just has a hell of a lot of very weird properties. These properties are so specific, it explains why everything seems to be the way it is. This is the absolute extreme of very simple ontology. Super fucking complex ideology. You're going to have a hell of a lot of weird predicates. But it's a neat view. So, deciding how best to sort of settle this ideology-ontology trade-off is a difficult and thorny matter. And we're going to talk more about it in the next few weeks. But note the fact that there is this doesn't undermine Quine's method. It just highlights that the method itself doesn't settle judgments over cases, which is exactly what we wanted. It just helps set us up so we can have those debates. And settling this is actually a central topic in contemporary metaphysics and contemporary metametaphysics. Okay. We'll talk more about regimentation on Friday, because I want to talk a little bit about this. But note, what we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about set theory and relations. So there's some reading on this. The reading can get kind of complex quite quickly. Don't stress too much about following all of the formulations and the proofs. Just get the basic ideas down. We'll talk more about it next Tuesday. For Friday, I'm going to put up, as I say, some response questions. It'll be about some of the things we've done, or applying some of the things we've done. They'll be up later today. Thank you guys for coming. Have a lovely rest of the day. And we'll see you all Friday.